Welcome to today's food safety webinar. Today's topic is an introduction to the Preventative Controls for Human Food Rule, and this webinar is specifically geared to small farms. I'm Colette D. Phelps. I'm with the University of Idaho Extension, and I will be your moderator today. Today's presenter is Stephanie Smith with Washington State University. She's a consumer food safety specialist, and she knows the ins and outs of the Preventative Controls rule, and we're really happy to have her today. I'm going to go over some webinar tips before I turn the presentation over to Stephanie. If this is your first webinar, it could be helpful to you to close all the other programs running on your computer so that your bandwidth is dedicated to the webinar. If you do happen to run into some problems with your sound, the speed at which things are transitioning, you do have a call-in number in your welcome email which you can use. Go ahead and call in on that number and then mute your computer so you don't get feedback if you decide to use the phone. At the bottom of your screen, you have a question box. You can type in questions for Stephanie at any time. We'll stop definitely probably once in the middle of the webinar and at the end to answer any questions that you have. There's also a chat box, and in the chat box is where you can type any questions you have about technical issues that might be going on with the webinar. So if you're experiencing a problem with sound, please let me know, and I will let you know if that's just on your end or if that's in the webinar overall, and that will help you know whether or not you should call in. At the end of the webinar, there will be a slide, and I'll talk to you about upcoming webinars and also let you know where you'll be able to find a PDF of the handouts of today's webinar. That way you don't have to write down all of the content of the webinar. Know that you're going to be able to print that out. Just go ahead and take additional notes for yourself today. With that, I want to go ahead and hand the webinar over to Stephanie. Thank you so much for presenting today.
Thank you. And I am glad to be able to talk about the Preventive Control for Human Food Rule with everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to give a brief introduction on the Food Safety Modernization Act and the Preventive Control for Human Food Rule. I'll talk about exemptions and requirements, even if one is exempted. We will discuss the definition of farm versus a facility, and then discuss the fundamentals of preventive controls for human food. So the Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law in 2011, and it's composed of 7 rules. So one of the rules, of course, is preventive controls for human food. The goal of the Food Safety Modernization Act was to prevent food safety hazards across the entire food system. So as you look at the different rules, you can see that it includes foreign supplier verification programs, sanitary transport, produce safety. So again, across the entire food system. So preventive controls for human food applies if you manufacture, process, pack, or hold human food for consumption in the United States. The compliance dates have been rolling out over the last several years, and large businesses were the first that needed to comply beginning in 2016. But now, as of September of 2018, all businesses that are covered under the rule should be in compliance with this rule. Very small businesses are considered those that average less than $1 million per year in annual sales, and this includes the market value of food that's manufactured, processed, packed, or held without sale as well. And this value is adjusted yearly for inflation. The Preventive Control for Human Food rule does have some exemptions and modified requirements. A qualified facility is a business with average annual sales of less than $500,000. and at least half of the sales have to be to consumers, local retailers, restaurants, or Indian reservations within the same state or within 275 miles. Other qualified facilities include very small businesses averaging less than $1 million adjusted for inflation, which includes both sales of human food plus the market value of human food that is manufactured, processed, packed, or held without sale. And again, this is the average per year during the 3-year period preceding the current calendar year and is adjusted each year for inflation. If you are able to qualify for an exemption, you still have requirements you need to meet. One of the requirements is that you have to notify FDA about your status and attest that you are still either identifying the hazards through preventive controls and monitoring preventive controls, which we'll discuss more about later in this webinar, that you're complying with applicable non-federal food safety regulations, and notifying consumers of the name and complete business address of the facility where the food was manufactured or processed. You must submit these notifications to the FDA and register your facility. If you are an otherwise qualified exempted facility that does not notify FDA, you are subject to hazard analysis and preventive controls. So you will have to comply if you do not register and notify FDA that you have an exemption. Qualified exempted businesses must also follow conditions and practices for processing safe food under sanitary conditions. So these are known as current good manufacturing practices. And this includes things such as personnel, worker health and hygiene, maintaining plants, the food processing facility and grounds, processing food under sanitary operations, and maintaining sanitary facilities, keeping your equipment clean and in good working order, and also managing the food warehousing and distribution, and then also any holding and distribution of human food byproducts for use as animal feed. Some of the most difficult questions we get is whether a operation is a farm or a facility. And this can be quite difficult to answer. So we'll try to cover it here as best as possible. A farm is exempt from FDA's food facility registration requirement and does not have to register with the FDA. So it's not subject to preventive control requirements. So in general, a farm, under the definition, includes on-farm packing or holding of produce, and this would actually fall under the produce safety rule and not the preventive controls for human food rule. So there's very strict definition of what encompasses a farm, and there's two kinds of farming operations. One is a primary production farm, and the second is a secondary activities farm. So what is a primary production farm? So this is an operation that's under one management in general, but not necessarily in a continuous location, which is devoted to the growing of crops, harvesting of crops, raising of animals, or any combination of these activities. So, for example, a primary production farm can pack or hold raw agricultural products, manufacture, process, pack, or hold processed foods, as long as the food is consumed on that farm, or another under the same management, or the manufacturing processing falls into limited categories. So there's a very strict definition about what is a primary production farm. A secondary activities farm is an operation that's not located on a primary production farm, but it is devoted to farming activities such as harvesting, packing, or holding raw agricultural products. The primary production farm has to own or jointly own a majority interest in the secondary activities farm in order to qualify as a secondary activities farm. And so if either of these conditions apply, then the farm would be exempt from preventive controls for human food rule. There are manufacturing processing activities that can occur on the farm, but would still fall under a farm definition, which would still be exempted activities. So this includes such things like drying or dehydrating raw agricultural commodities, treatment to manipulate ripening of the agricultural commodity, or packaging and labeling raw agricultural commodities. So these can be done without falling into that processing definition and without falling into having to comply with preventive controls for human food. So manufacturing processing that is not within the farm definition would include such things as pitting dried plums, chopping herbs, making snack chips or flours from legumes, roasting different nuts or seeds. All those types of activities are considered processing and manufacturing. And if you're doing any of these activities, you would be covered under preventive controls rule. This slide, probably if you're on a smaller computer, you probably can't even read it. The whole reason why I have this up here is to show that it is complex, to try to figure out if you are covered or not. And I do highly recommend that if you think you might be covered or you're just not sure, to please reach out to your state Department of Agriculture or to Extension, and they can help you or put you in touch with somebody who can help you determine if you're going to be covered by the rule or not. I'm going to move on now to talk about the requirements for preventive controls for human food. So the very fundamental aspect of this rule is that you have to have and implement a written food safety plan. And in this plan, you must identify food safety hazards that require a preventive control. And then you need to implement the preventive control to minimize or prevent the hazard. And we'll talk more about the details of this over the next, the remainder of this webinar. So this written food safety plan must have a hazard analysis in it. It needs to list the preventive controls. There needs to be a risk-based supply chain program, and you need to have a recall plan. More information on this can be found at the link provided at the bottom of the slide. So to talk about each of these separately, I'll begin discussing what a hazard analysis is. So in conducting a hazard analysis, you must identify any known or reasonably foreseeable hazard, and then determine if those hazards require a preventive control. So some examples of hazards can include biological hazards, so bacteria, viruses, parasites, or fungi. You can have chemical hazards, so allergens falls under a chemical hazard. So does chemical adulteration of food. And then you can have physical hazards. So some common physical hazards that we see in processed foods include glass, rubber, plastic pieces, and metal pieces. So when you're looking at your process, you need to determine if any of these hazards exist in your process. Usually the biggest one we see is, of course, concerns for bacteria. For if a hazard has been identified during the hazard analysis, you must develop and implement a plan to significantly minimize or prevent the hazard from occurring. So some examples that might be in your plan include process controls, allergen controls, sanitation controls, or other controls as you have identified or determined are needed. And I will discuss these in more detail. So process controls, an example of this might be for biological, you might put in a cooking step to make sure that the food is cooked to the proper temperature to kill microorganisms. You might put in a refrigeration or freezing step to slow the growth of microorganisms. You might adjust the pH down to make the food more acidic to inhibit microbial growth, or you could adjust the water activity. These would be all examples of process controls for controlling biological hazards. For chemical hazards, some things you might do would be dedicating equipment, for example. So if you identify that the product that you're processing has an allergen in it, and you're also making a product that is supposed to be free of that allergen, then you might decide to use dedicated equipment as part of the control, and then verify that the correct labels are being put on the product. We see this a lot with recalled products. There's a lot of products that are recalled for allergens, and a lot of times it's because the wrong label was put on a product. So that would be one one way to address chemical hazards or allergens. Physical hazards, one example of that might be if you're using metal within your processing, then at the end of the processing the product, you might want to put a metal detector in to make sure that no metal shavings have entered into the food product. So a lot of times larger processors will use metal detectors to be able to ensure that metal shavings have not inadvertently ended up in the product. So process controls must have parameters, including minimum and maximum values. So I give an example of this. So for example, if you're going to be heating the product to kill bacteria, then maybe your product needs to have an internal temperature within a range of 160 to 165 degrees Fahrenheit for a minimum of 30 seconds to ensure destruction of the microorganism. Your process control has to have a monitoring step. So an example of this would be checking the product temperature on 10% of the products using a calibrated thermometer. You also have to have a corrective action in place if you find out that you're not meeting the parameters. So an example of a corrective action would be if it's out of range, you're going to adjust the equipment cooking temperature and then reprocess the food and then re-verify that the food is up to temperature now and that corrected the problem. You need to have verification and validation of the process. So some examples might be verifying that your corrective action worked, and also having a validated process to ensure that what you're doing is going to be effective at killing the microorganism that you're trying to get rid of in your food that you've identified as a hazard. And then you need to keep records. So for this example, some records that might need to be kept are ones such as thermometer calibration records and reprocessing records, and then disposition of the product once a corrective action has been put into place. And also product temperature logs. For food allergen controls, you need to have procedures, practices, and processes to control the allergen cross-contact and ensure proper labeling. So within these procedures, practices, and processes, you need to perform monitoring. So an example of monitoring for food allergen controls might be checking to ensure that the correct labels were applied to the food, making sure that you're using dedicated equipment, that you're doing appropriate cleaning for allergen removal, and you're performing supplier verification to make sure that they're giving you the product that you requested, and if it's supposed to be allergen free, to ensure that that product truly is allergen free. A corrective action for food allergen controls might be relabeling the product if the wrong label was applied, or maybe you're going to end up destroying or diverting the contaminated product. You need to have verification in place. So an example of this might be verifying that your corrective action worked. So if, for example, that wrong labels were placed on a product, that those wrong labels were removed and the correct ones were applied. And then for records, an example might be record that there was a deviation, the deviation was remedied, and a corrective action was applied, and then disposition of that product. Some examples, I have some examples here for sanitation controls. If you're using a sanitation control, again, you got to have procedure, practices, and processes to ensure that the facility is maintained in a sanitary manner to control the hazards. And again, with good manufacturing practices, you need to have sanitation practices in place already. In this instance, we're talking about using sanitation as part of your preventive controls. So monitoring, you have to do monitoring. So an example of this might be regular swabbing, initiating a regular swabbing protocol to detect Listeria species if Listeria is going to be an issue with your product. And then a corrective action that you might have in place might be, if you get a positive result, that you're going to hold the food product for microbial testing until re-cleaning and sanitizing of the equipment is performed. And then you're going to verify that that corrective action was effective by retesting for Listeria species. And then, of course, you're going to need to keep records. So some of these records might include environmental monitoring records, such as what areas you swabbed, when you did it, who did it, and what time it was done, what the test results were for those samples that were taken, and then any corrective actions that were applied. So we're now going to move on to talking about risk-based supply chain program. So the rule states that if a hazard is related to ingredients from a supplier and you depend on your supplier to control the hazard, you must have and implement a supply chain program and perform verification. So you can control for the hazard yourself if you wish, but if instead you want your supplier to control for the hazard, then you have to have a risk-based supply chain program in place. Okay, so with a risk-based supply chain, you have to use approved suppliers, and you need to determine what supplier verification activities are going to be required. So this might include on-site audits, doing sampling and testing of the materials yourself, or verifying their records for any sampling and testing that they did. And then you also want to conduct a supplier verification, and then also obtain documents such as copies of records, copies of any laboratory test results, sampling and testing dates and times, and product types, and any audit records. And so these are things that you might put into your food safety plan for verifying the supply chain. So the last part of the food safety plan that you have to have in place is the recall plan. If you have done your hazard analysis and it has identified a hazard that you have to control, then you have to have a written recall plan as part of the preventive controls rule for human food. Your recall plan must include procedures for conducting a recall, the steps that need to be taken to perform the recall, and then the assignment of responsibility. So who's going to do what job within the recall, within the different steps of the recall, what's their contact information and their job title, so that this is all clearly laid out before you have to actually initiate a recall, which hopefully you would never have to do. The recall plan steps that should also be in there would include notification to regulators. So which regulators need to be notified, is their contact information, and who's going to be responsible for notifying the regulators. There should be steps in place for notifying the receivers of your product of the recall. Again, you want to have a dedicated person that's responsible for this, and you should be able to easily access and trace who that food product went to. You want to have steps in place for how you're going to dispose of the affected food. So, for example, if you're doing a recall, do you want the actual product to come back to you, or do you want the consumers to throw it, or the receivers to throw it away? Most people usually want that food to come back to them so that they can make sure that the recall was effective and be able to track how much of the product that they got back. You also will want to have somebody in charge of notifying the public, and you should determine ahead of time how that is going to be done. Are you going to contact the local newspapers, other news agencies? Of course, when you're working with your regulator, FDA puts out recall notices all the time, but what other ways might you need to notify the public? And then again, just to re-emphasize, you want to be able to verify your recall effectiveness. So a lot of times we highly recommend that people perform a mock recall to make sure that their plan is working, and that and so one thing you can do is, if you're processing food, you can let the people that you sell the product to, let them know that you're going to be conducting a mock recall, and see if you can actually trace a specific lot number and see how much of that food is on the shelves, for example. So we always recommend that so that you can take steps to modify your recall plan if you need to, so that if you do happen to have a recall, you can ensure that it's going to be effective. One more regulation under preventive controls rule is that you must have a preventive controls qualified individual. And who this is an individual who's successfully completed training in the development and application of risk-based preventive controls. And FDA specifically states that the training that this person has undergone must be at least equivalent to that received under a standardized curriculum. Right now, that curriculum is the FSPCA Preventive Controls for Human Food course. And this is a 2.5-day intensive training where it goes over all the details of preventive controls rule and how to actually put together a food safety plan. Alternatively, one can be qualified through job experience in developing and applying a food safety system. Most people do just take the FSPCA course, but the one thing to know is that if you are under the PCHF rule, your food safety plan must be prepared by or overseen by a Preventive Controls qualified individual. So this is the regulation for that and for meeting that requirement. One other aspect of the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule were some revisions to the good manufacturing practices. So the rule now requires that employees must be qualified to perform their assigned duties and be trained in the principles of food hygiene and food safety. And on top of the training, you have to maintain training records showing what the employee was trained on, the date and time that the training occurred, and what topics were covered. So those records have to be kept on file. There's also new GMP requirements for allergen cross-contact, and you have to employ practices and procedures to control allergen cross-contact. And there's also new provisions for holding and distribution of human food byproducts that are going to be used for animal food. Okay, so in summary, the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule covers the manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding of human food. And if you are not exempted from this regulation, then you should already be in compliance with it. We can help you determine if you're going to be exempt or covered. Again, it can be really complex to try to determine if you're going to be considered a farm or a facility. And even if you do fall under the farm definition, you might be exempted from the Preventive Controls rule, but then be required to comply with other regulations, such as the produce safety rule. Even if you're qualified exempt, you have to register your facility with the FDA. You have to follow current good manufacturing practices. You need to keep your paperwork showing what your average yearly sales were, because FDA can request this to determine if you're truly exempt or not. And then you also must label your food with the name and complete business address of the facility where that food was produced or processed. So these need to be done regardless, even if you're qualified exempt. If you are covered under the rule, you must have a Preventive Controls qualified individual to oversee the food safety plan and both the development and implementation of that plan. And it's probably best to just take the standardized training rather than trying to demonstrate to FDA that you have the experience. Most people just take the training. And last but not least, we have many resources available, both through Extension, through the Food and Drug Administration, through the state agricultural departments. So don't be afraid to reach out, and we're here to try to help you comply with these new regulations and make a determination as to whether you're exempt or not. So here's a list of some additional resources that you might want to look into. And with that, I can take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Stephanie. If you're watching today's webinar, please go ahead and type your questions into the question box. And while I'm waiting to see if any questions come in, I have a couple things that I would like to ask Stephanie.
Sure.
Just to make sure that I'm clear and our audience is clear about being a farm and how being a farm relates to the Preventative Controls and Human Food rule. Is it the situation that if you are a farm, a primary farm, primary activity farm, secondary activity farm, that you are always exempt from this rule, or are there conditions under which you would not be exempt?
So the regulation is very strict about what the definition of a farm is. And so if you're meeting that definition, then you would be exempt. But as soon as the farm starts doing other activities, such as some of the examples I gave were chopping herbs, making snack chips or flours from legumes, as soon as those types of activities are taking place, you are no longer considered a farm. You would be considered a facility covered under the rule. So they're very strict. I mean, you can dehydrate a product. You can use ethylene gas to ripen the product. You can package the product into clamshells, but you know, as soon as those are not considered processing activities. But you know, making flour is considered processing, and then in that case you would not be exempted anymore.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a couple questions that came in. Doug and Shannon ask, if we're considered a farm, are we able to use the Idaho Cottage Food Bill as our exemption?
That is a good question. Let me think about that for a minute. So the cottage, that's a really good question. I might need to check into that more and get back to you on that.
I can jump in and share my perspective.
And I apologize too, because I'm also in Washington State, and so I'm not as familiar with Idaho's cottage food bills. And I will say though, if you would have to fall under FDA's definition as a farm. So go ahead and chime in, Colette, and then I might add more to what you say.
Okay. As I understand the rule, the federal rules are essentially separate from the state level rules, whether your cottage food bill is in Idaho or in Washington or another state. So you need to look at the requirements of the FSMA, Preventative Controls and Human Food Rule. If you are a farm under that rule, then are you doing activities on the farm that are exempt from the rule? And so that's not going to be whether or not those activities that you're doing on the farm are covered under a cottage food bill at the state level. They're going to be whether or not FDA under this particular rule says, yes, you can do that on the farm and be exempt. So for instance, you can pack and hold raw agricultural products. You can also dry some agricultural products. And there is a very detailed list of what you can do on the farm and still be exempt from the Preventative Controls and Human Food Rule. And if they're not on that list, then they're going to fall into where you need to comply and you need to do the training and develop your food safety plan. For what you need to look at in your state, you need to talk to your health department that has jurisdiction where your farm is located. In Idaho, those are regional health departments. In other states, they might be more at a county or state level. So you're going to want to check that out. But essentially, you are beholding to multiple rules when you decide to process food. And a state rule is not necessarily going to exempt you from a federal rule. That's my understanding.
Yeah, and that is correct. Thank you, Colette. And I agree with what she said 100%. And to kind of expand that a little more, and with cottage foods, for example, and I will assume it's the same in Idaho, you cannot sell across state lines usually. And so So then you might be a qualified exempted facility under preventive controls for human food if you have sales of 500,000 or less, and over half of that food is going within a 275-mile radius of where you're selling it. So there might be areas where you end up being exempted, but as Colette said, these are two different regulations, and even if you might be exempt from one, you still need to comply with others.
Yes. We have a second question, and Kelly is asking, for a farm with gross income of less than 500 or 50,000 that wants to process freeze-dried produce on the farm, would we be exempt? They're in Washington State, but the exemption they're asking about is under Preventative Controls for human food. Right. So that's the first part, processing freeze-dried produce on the farm.
So you can dehydrate. Dehydrating produce is exempted. I am unsure about freeze drying produce because that is a different process for that, and that might actually fall under processing. For that one, I would have to check with I would have to check into that more for that specific type of processing, if that's covered or not.
Okay, thank you. And then the second part of that question is, what if they wanted to make hot sauce with their peppers and tomatoes and seal using pressure cooling?
Yes, so if you're making a hot sauce, hot sauces fall under different regulations, or they can potentially fall under different regulations depending on, essentially it's going to depend on the pH of the product. So with that, I mean, definitely you would have to go through WSDA and get a processor's license from them to do that. And you would definitely need to register the business. And again, for both activities that you mentioned, it's really going to depend to, with regard to preventive controls for human food, if you're selling that, where that product is going to. Is it being sold within a 275-mile radius? Is it, is it being sold, across the country? And then, so there's going to be a lot of variables with that. With definitely the hot sauce product, that product would need to undergo testing to help determine where it's going to fall under the regulations.
So as we can see, the regulation is quite complex.
Yes.
And really, I think that as a producer or a small food processor, it really is important that you reach out to your State Department of Agriculture and your health district within which you operate to understand really clearly what your state rules are, and then how this federal rule may or may not also impact you, because you will need to be able to demonstrate that you are doing, good manufacturing processes, and your Department of Health is really going to be there to help you navigate this landscape. You can also contact Cooperative Extension. Most counties do have a Cooperative Extension office. If their educator does not know enough about the rule to feel that they could guide you on that, they will connect you to someone like myself or Stephanie that can help walk you through the rule. And as you can see, we do have some resources here where you can go and look at the Preventative Controls rule. And then within these extension resources, Washington State University does have a number of trainings that have been subsidized by grants to make them much more affordable. And you can sign up to be on an email list to be notified of all the different trainings they have related to food processing. University of Idaho, we do have a produce safety website that's specifically looking at the produce safety rule for farmers, and that URL is here. And then the Pacific Northwest Food Safety website is the website for the project that is bringing this webinar series to you. And we will be continuing to update that website with additional resources. One of the resources that we are creating is a tool that you can answer specific questions about your farm or your processing business, and it will help you understand how the rule likely applies to you. And those are going to be developed over the next few months.
So for those that can see in the chat box, under Kelly's question, I did put down my email address there, so hopefully you guys can see that. I wasn't, Colette, I'm not sure if there's a better way to put that up there, but feel free to reach out to me, and then if I do not have the answer, we do have a processing specialist here that's very familiar with all of the different types of FDA regulations, because some of the foods could potentially fall under other regulations. So, for example, if you were a seafood processor, you wouldn't fall under this rule, but you would fall under seafood HACCP, for example, or if you're making juice, that would fall under juice HACCP plans. So it starts getting really complex as to the type of product and exactly how it's getting processed. And so it's better to try to address those one-on-one. And I can always put you, if I can't answer your question, I can put you in contact with our processing specialist who can definitely answer your question.
Great, thank you so much. So I double checked, and I put my email in as well into the question and answer box. I will make sure that you also have those links from the website recording, and you will receive an automatic email following this webinar that will give you, again, the website addresses where you're going to be able to find the recording to this webinar and additional information. Will probably take me until tomorrow afternoon to get the webinar and that information posted, but it will be there, and you are definitely welcome to contact me at any time. Stephanie, we don't have any other questions, so if we could go ahead and go to the next slide.
Sure. There we go.
Okay, so we do have a couple other webinars coming up in May and additional webinars in June. So if you go back to the Pacific Northwest FoodSafety.org website, or if you go to cultivatingsuccess.org and click on Idaho and webinars, you'll be able to register for those webinars. Tomorrow, we have a webinar that is looking at harvest and post-harvest sanitation practices. On the 28th, we're looking at one that's related to food safety and biological soil amendments. So those are definitely for farmers, and we hope that you can join us for one of those webinars or to go ahead and watch them after they've been recorded and posted on the website. So thank you very much for joining us today. Definitely let us know if you have any other questions, and we hope you have a great Monday. Thank you, Stephanie.